Chav Chesam Beis, we're 4 lines from the bottom, Rav Katina. Just to get us back into the flow, the Gemara brought down a machloikis between Rav and Rav Kahana. The machloikis seemingly is if you shecht 50% of the pipe, is that yotza? Meaning, is it that you have to cut more than a minority or you have to cut a majority? So if you cut 40, let's say a bird, you have to cut one pipe. Yeah. So if you cut 49% of the pipe, no good. You cut 51, it's for sure good. The question is 50. That seemingly is a machlekes Rav and Rav Kahana. So the Gemara has the following question. Now Rav's svara is that 50% is roiv in halacha. Now I'm going to say outside what this kasha is going to be, and then it'll become clear. Because 50% is not minority. Roiv is not minority. That's Rav Shita. And the Gemara is going to amend this, that Rav did not say this in most places. Rav did not say it by Shchita. The Gemara will get there. But the Gemara's kasha is basically as follows. If you have a cheres kli, the halacha is that you cannot toivel in a mikveh, right? Cheres kli, kalim cannot be fixed in a mikveh. So what do? You have to break it. The definition of breaking the kli is that the majority of the kli is broken. So you could split it into 3 parts, 33%, 33%, 33%. So says the Gemara, let's say I take the kli and I split it 50% mamish, 50% on my right side, 50% on my left side, mamish, like down the middle, mamish. The halacha is that it's not batal. Why? Because we assume it's impossible to be 50% mamish. I mean, it's probably 51-49, you just don't see it. But says the Gemara, Lu Yitzur, let's say there was a scientific way to prove it was 50-50, the halacha is it would be batal. Because there's no majority. Again, as long as you don't have a majority, the kli is broken. If 50% is a majority, then why are you saying if it's 50 and 50, there's no majority? On the contrary, you have 2 majorities. That's the kasha of Rav. And Rav's going to respond, there's no such thing as 2 majorities. 50% might be a majority when it's isolated. But to have 50%, it's impossible to have 2 majorities from one kli. That's Rav's point. Generally, 50% is a majority. Not in this context. It says, let's see it inside. Rav Katina Tashema, Chilk L'Shnaim. You have a kli cheres that's tameh, and you break it 50% to 50% mamish. The halacha is, Vehin Shavin, they look the same. Shneim Tmeim, they're both tameh. Why? Because we assume that it's impossible to be 50% mamish. And therefore, mistama, it's 51%, 49%, in which case the kli is not yet broken. Because it's impossible to be 50-50 mamish. It's impossible for humans to do something as exact. But that's the brisa. But says the Gemara, the deduction of the brisa is, ha'efshel etzamtzem, if you were able to split it 50-50 mamish tahar, it will be tahar. Why? Because there's no longer a roiv. And therefore it's a broken kli. But says the kasha, according to Rav, amai taharim, but according to Rav, 50% is a roiv, then why is it tahar? Zil hacha ikaruba. On the contrary, I have 2 roivs. So says the Gemara, Amrav Papa, trei rubi b'chad manaleka. There's no such thing as 2 roivs in one kli. You can't have that. You could have one roiv, but now you're going to say there's 2 roivs. It's impossible. Right? You got 2 quarterbacks, you got no quarterback, right? So you can't have 2 roivs. It's an impossibility. That's the Gemara says. Okay. So says the Gemara Vaiter, last kasha, actually 2 more kashas. Tashema, shochat chatzi groigeris v'shahaba. Okay, so basically, we don't paskin like this. I want to make that clear because I was learning this yesterday and I was like, that sounds very strange. We do not paskin this way. But the Gemara at this point understands like this. If you shecht, now we paskin that if you shecht a part of the animal and then pause for the amount of time that it takes to shecht an animal, let's say 1 minute. Okay, it's not, but let's say you shecht and then you pause for a minute, it's psul. The Gemara in this point disagrees with that. The Gemara at this point, which we do not paskin like, the Gemara at this point feels that if you shechted only 50% of the pipe and then you pause, it's not a problem. Why? Because, says the Gemara, because 50% is not considered a shchita anyway, meaning the animal can still survive at 50%. 50% is not a maisa shchita, and because it's not a maisa shchita, you didn't pause in the maisa shchita. I think we don't pass in this way, but you see from this Gemara that 50% is not considered roiv, because if 50% was considered roiv, then the pause should invalidate it. That's the Gemara's kasha. Tashema shacha chatzi gregoris v'shahaba. You severed half of the trachea, and then you paused. You paused the requisite amount to shecht another animal, v'gamra, and then you finished it, shchita kshera. It's kosher. Why? Because you didn't pause in the middle of the shchita. The first 50% doesn't count. it's considered a miyut. That's not considered a ma'aser shchita. Then you paused, then you finished it. The second part is considered the entire ma'aser shchita. So there was no pause in the middle of ma'aser shchita. Again, we don't paskin this way, but that's the Gemara's theory. The Gemara says, "V'i amr mechza mechza karoiv." But wait a minute. If you believe that 50% is considered a roiv, then itrafalei. Then I don't understand. You're telling me again, I cut the animal, the first half of the animal, the first half of the pipe, then I pause. Then I continue. The halach is it's kosher. Why? Because the first pause doesn't even count. Doesn't matter. We just start from the second point, because 50% is nothing. But if 50% is roiv, then you've trafed up the animal. Right? Because let's assume we're talking about a behema, yeah? Let's assume we're talking about a behema. You have to cut both pipes. I start with the trachea. I cut 50%. I pause. Then I cut the esophagus. If 50% of the trachea is considered roiv, then I cut one pipe, basically. I paused, and then I cut a second pipe. That should definitely be a problem. If you tell me that 50% is a miyut, so it's nothing in halacha, okay, I get it. You cut 50%, which is nothing. You paused, okay, which is nothing. And then I started now. But if according to Rav that 50% is roiv, so when I cut 50% of the trachea, and we assume we're talking about a behema over here. So I cut 50% of the behema, I started the shchita process, I paused mid-shchita, and then I continued. Why is that kosher? That should definitely be treif.
The concept is that when you cut one of this and one in half, totally 100%, and you don't touch the other one, it's treif.
100% in half? What do you mean 100% in half?
100% in half. You get the 50.
I cut one simon, and then that's a treifa for sure. Yeah,
You have to do two at the
correct. So says the Gemara, if we're talking about a behema, and I cut 50%, and then I pause, why is the animal kosher? So the Gemara says, who said we're talking about a behema? We're talking about a bird. And I'll tell you why I'm a manavshach by a bird, it's going to be fine. You only have to cut one simon. I cut 50% of the simon, and then I pause, and then I do the rest. I'll tell you, manavshach, it's fine. If 50% is roiv, I've already done a ma'aser shchita. I don't care about the pause. It's over. If 50% is a miyut, I didn't start the shchita yet. It's only a shaila by a behema where you have to cut both. Where after one, you have to then immediately go to the second. But if you're talking about a bird, you only have to cut one. So I cut half the trachea, then I pause, then I finish the trachea. Memanashach, it's going to be fine. If 50% is roiv, I already did a full ma'aser shchita before the pause. And if 50% is a miyut, I didn't do anything before the pause, and then I finished it. So the Gemara answers, we're talking about a bird. Now, we don't pass this way because we pass that even by a bird, if you pause halfway, it's a psul. But that's the Gemara. The Gemara is saying. If you cut half of it and then pause and then you do the rest, yes. By a bird it will be a psul, but it's not good. It's not for now. I just want to make that point out. Mi saber bebehem alay ba'oif. Memanashach. By a bird it's fine. Memanashach. I mechza mechza karoiv havile ruba. I mechza mechza in karoiv lo yavel leklum. Okay. One last kasha, and this is going to be a knockout. Again, according to Rav, if I cut 50% of the bird's pipe, yoitza. Here's the problem. The problem is, Tashima, Haresha Yachatzi Kana Pogum. You have an animal that got in a fight with another animal, and it has a half laceration through the trachea. Half of the trachea is cut. Stop. You know what the halach is? It's talking outside. The halach is, it's still alive. It's fine. But wait a minute. If you're telling me 50% is rive, then it should be a treifa. Easy. It's simple shaila. Says the Gemara, Haresha Yachatzi Kana Pogum v'hoisim kol shiva Gemara. The kasha is, if you're telling me 50% is raiv, then when it got lacerated 50%, it's already a treifa. So why is it kosher? So the Gemara responds, here's the difference. The difference is, by shchita, 50% is enough. By a treifa, you need to be 51%. Why? It's a pella. Says the Gemara, Amarava, shani le'inin treifa. Treifa is different. To be in a raiv, hanir le'inayim. Meaning, by shchita, 50% is enough. And that's what Rav was saying, because it's raiv. But by a treifa, you need to be 51% to make the animal treifa. Why? Because for a treifa, you don't need roiv. You need roiv hanira le'inayim. It's like how many people from eating, how many people that to daven with a minion, right? You need 6. But then for benching with Baruch Lekeinu Shacham Shaloi, you need 7, right? Because you need a roiv hanira le'inayim, right? 7 bread and 3 mezainis. Roiv hanira le'inayim. So over here, you need roiv hanira. Here's the pella though. This is very hard to understand. You're telling me that for shchita 50% is enough, but by a treifa, which is more severe in halacha, right? If you have a slight puncture of the lung, a tiny pinprick that goes through the lungs, you know what the halacha is? Treifa. So you're telling me treifa you need 51%. 50% is nothing. It's fine. But by shchita 50% is enough? Doesn't make any sense. We're more strict by treifa. So why by treifa 50% is not enough? By shchita 50% is kosher, yeah. But by treifa you need 51%. Doesn't make any sense. Treifa were more strict in general in halacha. Doesn't make any sense. Why would by treifa? This is a leniency. I have a 50% cut. The animal's still kosher. It's fine. 51%. Now it's a treifa. Treifa is more severe than shchita in general in halacha. It should be whatever. Shchita should not be treated more, 50%, oh, that's enough. But treifa, it had to be 51%. Doesn't make any sense. Treifa should be even more strict. Either the same or more strict, not more lenient. So it says the Gemara, Amarle Abaya, like kol b'chaynu, it's a kal v'chaymer. Umat treifa de b'mashu mitzvah. For a treifa, which certain invalidations are even a pinprick, Hecha to be in a rov, but in a rov near lanayim, and still 50% is not enough. You need 51%. Then shchita, da'deika ruba loy miskasha loy kol shekin in a rov lanayim. Shchita, which you need rov, shouldn't it be a rov hanikar? Meaning, if treva, which is so severe, you need 51%. Shchita, you also don't need 51%. It's a pella. So it says the Gemara, scrap everything we talked about till now. Of course, you need 51%. 50% is not enough. I thought Rav said 50% enough. He wasn't talking about shchita. You know what he was talking about? He was talking about the carbon pesach. The halacha is that by the carbon pesach, if people are tamei meis, if they're individuals, they go to Pesach Sheni. If roiv of Klal Yisrael are tamei meis, then Pesach Rishon is brought in a state of tumah. Here's the shaila. What if 50% of Klal Yisrael, it's 100 Jews, 50 Jews, God forbid, there's 10 million Jews, 5 million Jews are tamei meis, mamish 50%. That's what Rav said. 50% is roiv. He wasn't talking about shchita. He was saying to allow the carbon pesach to be brought in a state of tumah, it can be brought as long as it's 50% of Klal Yisrael in a state of tumah. It doesn't have to be 51%. Okay. Says the Gemara, El Dekuli Yama Mechsa Mechsa Inikarev. Everyone agrees for shchita 50% is not enough. And this machlekes Rav Kahana was not referring to shchita in Pesach Itmar. It was referring to the carbon pesach. I don't know. I don't know the laws of Shemitah. I don't know. Hareisha Yisrael mechza tahor mechza tumeim. The halacha is that if 50% of Klal Yisrael are tamei and 50% are tahor, Rav Amar mechza karoiv. Rav says they're treated as roiv, and the Pesach Rishon is brought in a state of tumah, and they're not individuals that go to Pesach Sheni. Rav Kahana Amar mechza eina karov. Rav Kahana disagrees. Now the Gemara explains. Why is Rav saying that 50% is roiv for carbon Pesach to be brought in a state of Tumah? Because he says, because when the pasuk describes Pesach Sheni, it says individuals go to Pesach Sheni. Once you hit 50%, you're no longer individuals, and therefore for the laws of Pesach Sheni, you're considered tzibur. Okay. Now, this next Gemara is very simple, but it might help if I'll just read you the Mishnah. The Mishnah begins off like this. Hashoichet echad ba'oif v'shnayim bebehema shchitas ukshera. Okay, one or two, one by a bird, two by an animal. Rubai shalachad kamayu. Roiv is enough. So the Mishnah in the beginning of the Mishnah says roiv of a pipe is enough by a bird and by an animal. Good. Then the Mishnah ends off roiv echad ba'oif roiv shnayim bebehema shchitas ukshera. The Mishnah repeats itself at the Seifa. It says the exact same halacha, the Reisha and the Seifa, that roiv of a pipe is a pipe. Good. The question is, why do I repeat both? That's the question. So it says the Gemara, Tanina Chadazimna Rubi Shalacha Kamayu. Why does the Mishnah say the same halacha twice? So the Gemara says, Amrav Hoshia Chada B'Chulin V'Chada B'Kachim. This is the answer that everyone goes with, and that is, the Mishnah says that same halacha twice, and that is roiv of a pipe is enough. And it says it twice because one is talking about Chulin, and one is talking about karbanos, meaning, and I'll just say it outside, it's very simple. If I tell you by chulin that roiv's enough, I would say, yeah, by chulin's roiv's enough. But by karbanos, what's the main objective by a karban? You want to do the zrika. The zrika is blood, which means you want as much blood as possible. Maybe roiv is not enough. So you have to say the halacha twice, that roiv is enough by chulin, and roiv is enough by shchita. Okay. Says the Gemara, you need both. I'll tell you why. If you just said that roiv is enough by chulin, I would tell you. By chulin, roiv is enough because you don't actually want the blood. You just want to kill the animal in a humane way. But when it comes to kachim, the whole objective of kachim is to have blood to do zrika. Maybe the Torah wants a full pipe because that'll drain the blood out better. B'yashmin kachim, the opposite. If it just said the halacha by kachim, I would say mishum del adam hu tzarich. Avol chulin del adam loy tzarich ema bepalgasag delay. I would say the opposite. By kachim you need roiv, but maybe by chulin 50% is enough because you're not actually interested in the blood anyway. So therefore you have to say the same halacha applies to chulin and to kachim. Now, here is going to be a discussion. Yes. I would think chulin is always less. So if chulin is roiv, I would think kachim is entire. If kachim is roiv, I would say chulin is 50%. Because you don't need the blood. Now, so I've now established that the two statements of the Mishnah, the Reisha and the Seifa, one is chulin and one is kachim. And now the question is, which one is which? Is the Reisha chulin and the Seifa kachim? Or is the Seifa chulin and the Reisha kachim? All of the opinions, I believe there are 5 opinions, they all say the same thing. They all believe that the Reisha is the Chulin and the Seifa is the Kachim. Each one is just medayik, a different lashon and reading in the Mishnah that way. But everyone agrees that the beginning of the Mishnah begins with Chulin and ends with Kachim. Okay, let's just see it inside. Hai b'Chulin, hai b'Kachim. Which of the statements is Chulin and which of the statements is Kachim? So, Amar Rav Kahana, Mistaber Reisha b'Chulin v'Seifa b'Kachim. Rav Kahana is the first explanation, and he says the beginning is Chulin and then it ends off with Kachim. How do I know this? Because I'll tell you why. The first part of the Mishnah, if that was kachim, it wouldn't say hashochet, wouldn't it say hamolek? Right? Because you don't. It says hashochet echad ba'of. You don't shech the bird if it's a carbon. You do malik on a bird. So it must be hashochet echad ba'of is talking about chulin, which we shech chickens, and the ending is talking about kachim. Good. Says the Gemara, huh? Oh, so we'll get there in a second. So my father asked a good question. So what's the sefer with kachim? It doesn't say hamolek either. It says rov echad. It doesn't. It says shchitasok sheira. It doesn't say malika by the sefer anyway. So it says elamai sefer bekachim shchitasok sheira malikasok sheira mibayile. So the Gemara says that's not such a kasha. Halay kasha. I did it. Salik mibehema tanam shchitasok sheira. Ela reisha michti al oif kai yisalik that the bekachim amalik mibayile. The Gemara says the sefer not mentioning malika is not such a kasha because it's talking about an animal. So it mentions shchita, but the reisha. If it was talking about a carbon, it says hashoichet echad ba'oif. It starts off with bird. It would not say hashoichet by a bird if it's talking about a carbon. If you want to tell me the safe is carbonos, because we've been talking about animals the whole Mishnah, so okay, fine. So we mentioned shchita, even though it doesn't apply to a bird, fine. But the Reisha starts with a bird. The end of the Mishnah is chatzi bebehema shchita so psula. It's talking about a behema. So okay, we're talking about shchita by behema. So we didn't mention malika. But the Reisha starts off by a bird. You don't mention shchita by a bird if it's a carbon. So that's the first explanation. Rav Shim Ba'ashi Amar, he says the same thing, which is Reisha b'chulin mehacha. Again, they all agree the Reisha is chulin, the Seif is kachim. They just have different remazim and different ways to get to the same conclusion. Reisha b'chulin mehacha. His source is as follows: Diktani echad ba'oif. Notice how the Reisha. What does it say? Hasheichet echad ba'oif. How many pipes do you cut by a bird? 1. Do you do by a carbon, you cut 1 pipe? Not so pashut. By a chatas oif, it's 1 pipe. By oilas oif, it's 2 pipes, the malika is done. So you shouldn't say hashechet echad ba'oif. By chickens, it's always echad. But by carbonos, the oilas oif, you have to sever both pipes. So if it's talking carbonos, it should say shnayim. So the kasha is going to be, but in the sefer it doesn't say shnayim either. Okay, we'll get there. The Gemara says, "Dani echa ba'oiv." He the bekachim ha'ika oilasayv devayi shnei simanim. So the Gemara says the kashim my father mentioned before. Elamai sefer bekachim. Okay, so the sefer is talking about kachim, but the sefer doesn't mention 2 either. The sefer says, how does the sefer end? The sefer says ba'oiv roiv echad ba'oiv. Roiv echad ba'oiv doesn't mention 2 either. So says the Gemara, Elamai sefer bekachim roiv echad ba'oiv ha'ika oilasayv devayi shnei simanim. So the Gemara says, no, that's not so shver. My roiv echad rubai shel kol echad ve'echad. The end of the Mishnah I could interpret as echad as being each one, the majority of each pipe. By chatas if it's 1, by elos if it's 2. But the reisha is echad ba'oif. Echad ba'oif means only 1. That's not karbanos. The seifa is a little ambiguous that you could interpret it as the majority of each. The seifa is more each. The first is 1. 1 does not apply to karbanos because elos if there's 2. Says the Gemara, and the reason why it doesn't say 2 by the end of the Mishnah is because it doesn't want any confusion because chatasayif is 1. But at least roiv echad can be interpreted as the majority of each, as opposed to the reisha, which is rubai shel echad, one, not two. Okay, Rav Papa Amar, the same explanation, but a different source. Reisha b'chulin mehacha. The source that the first one is chulin is from here. Diktani Rav Yehuda Omer, ad sheyishchad es avridin, upligi rabbanon aleha. I'll tell you why. Because in the Reisha of the Mishnah, it mentions Rabbi Yehuda's Shita, that in addition to cutting the pipe, you also have to cut the jugular, the vridin. And the Rabbanon disagree. Is that chulin or karbanos? Says the Gemara, it makes sense they disagree by chulin. Karbanos, the whole point is to get as much blood as you can. Everyone agrees you should cut the jugular by karbanos. By chulin, it's a machlokes of do you need to do it in order to drain out the blood to help malicha purposes. The Rabbanan say no, it's not necessary. This says yes. It's a machlokes by chulin, but by karbanos, it's not a machlokes. Everyone should agree you should cut the jugular to get the karotic because that drains the blood more. So when the Reisha, it says a machlokes, it must be talking about chulin.
The Reisha is only Rabbi Yehuda that said that.
Yeah, the Tanakama doesn't mention it, hence it's an understood machlokes. The point is, it makes sense that there will be a machlokes by chulin, not by karbanos. The last approach is Rav Ashi Amar, Seifa be, actually there's two more. Seifa be kachim mehacha. He agrees, but instead of focusing as the Reisha being chulin, he's going to prove that the Seifa is kachim. How so? Diktani, hashoichet shnei rashim be'echad shchitas ksheira. Okay. Let me just let me explain. When we say Seifa of a Mishnah, we all know the Mishnayos were really one long Mishnah. So the Seifa of this Mishnah continues into the next Mishnah. The next Mishnah is basically going to say, Hashoichet shnei roshim ke'echad, shchitaso ksheira. Okay? Now the halacha is that if one person has two animals right next to each other, and I just have one knife and I just... The halacha is, it's kosher b'diavad. That's the next Mishnah. Let me ask you a question. Is that chulin or kachim? So if it's chulin, why can't I shecht 20 animals back to back? What's the difference? The answer is it's kachim. And what does it have to do with kachim? Because the pasuk says, by karbanos, lirtzonchem tizbachuhu. Now apparently there's a kri and a ksiv. Tizbachehu is singular. Tizbachuhu is plural. If you go with the way it's written, that means that you, as an individual shochet, have to shecht one animal at a time. That's by karbanos. So the Seifa is talking about a karban. That will explain why the next Mishnah, which is a continuation of the Seifa, says that it's b'di'eved to shech two animals at once. That's only by karbanos. By chulin, it's lichachila. Because why not? The whole reason why it's an Indian b'di'eved, only to do a b'di'eved, is because the pasuk says tizbachehu. That's by karbanos. So therefore, it makes sense. The end of the Mishnah is karbanos, because then it flows into the next Mishnah, which mentions ideally don't cut two animals at the same time. Why? Because the pasuk is, that's a pasuk by karbanos, and by karbanos is exeris hakasa that lechachila you shouldn't do it. Because although it's read tizbachuhu, which is plural, tizbachehu is singular. The Gemara says, it's only b'di'eved and not l'chachila. Why? Now, if you tell me it's kachim, I get it. I get why it's only it's b'di'eved. Why? Tizbach, the pasuk could have said tizbach. Tizbach is singular, meaning that you should not have two people holding the knife and shechting it together. But now our point, tizbachuhu. Now that means plural. But you should not have one person shech two animals back to back, right next to each other. Because it's a Korean ksiv, the way it's written is tizbachei, which is singular. That stringency is dafka by karbanos. It's not by chulin. So the Seifa, which mentions this stringency, is obviously talking about karbanos. But if it's talking about chulin, it's even mutter l'chachila.
So it's really saying this mission is connected to the next mission.
Correct. All right, let's go back there. There's a lot of daf. And the Gemara says, even Rish Lakish believes that the Reisha is chulin and the Seifa is kachim. Again, we said that the Mishnah says the same halacha twice. We said why? One's by chulin and one's by kachim. Why is that necessary? Because if it just said by chulin, I would say chulin, a roiv is enough. But by kachim, where you need the blood, I would say maybe you have to shech the entire animal. Rish Lakish said the same thing. Why? Because Rish Lakish says like this, once I know that roiv of the pipe is enough, lama shaninu. Then why does the Mishnah then say a second time? He mamash speaks it out. It said in the Reisha, roiv is enough. So why does the Seifa then say, That Rav is enough. In other words, Rish Lakish is bothered by our question, why does the Mishnah repeat itself? So said Rish Lakish, because there's a halacha, okay, the halacha was that on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol was brought the animals. He had to do everything. Everything on Yom Kippur must be done by the Kohen Gadol, but whatever he can get away with not doing, other people did. So what the Kohen Gadol would do is like this. He would take the Talmud Shel Shachar, he would shecht roiv of the pipes, then walk away. Someone else would take the knife and finish it. Now the reason why that's enough, the reason why that's fine to do is because roiv is enough. If roiv is not enough, then it's not okay. Yeah. No. Hevi'uloi satamid, they brought the Kohen Gadol of the Talmud. Kartsu, he made the incision. Umeirek achar shchitas al yadai, and another person completed the shchita, meaning he did roiv, and the other person finished it. He was busy. Now says Rish Lakish, Yachol loy meirek yehi pasal. You might think if I didn't have the Mishnah saying it second time, I might think roiv's not enough, and if he doesn't do all of it, it's pasal. Kamash malan, the Mishnah is saying roiv's enough. That's why the Mishnah had to say roiv's enough. That even by karbanos roiv's enough. Hence, explaining why the Kohen Gadol was able to just get away with roiv. 51. Now says the Gemara. Wait a minute. So you're telling me the chiddush of the Mishnah, the purpose of the Mishnah is to basically validate what the Kohen Gadol was doing. Let me ask you a question. And if roiv's not enough, so then how is someone else finishing it? Right? It must be enough. You don't need the Mishnah to tell me this. Of course, it's enough. Right? You need this Mishnah to tell me that roiv by a carbon is enough? Of course it's enough. I'll prove it to you it's enough. Why? Because the Kohen Gadol only did roiv. Someone else, I'm the Kohen Gadol, and the Rabbi, you finish it. So if roiv's not enough, then it's done by another person. It has to be done by the Kohen Gadol. So we need the Mishnah for it. It's Mefurish in the Mishnah in Yuma that it's enough. Says the Gemara, Yochel Yemerik Pasal, go to the next page. Im Ken Havli Avoida Ba'acher, Betanya, Kol it must be roiv's enough, because if roiv's not enough and you have to do all of it, then it's not being done by the Kohen Gadol. So the Gemara says, no, here's the answer. Roiv is enough, but I might think that it's Pasal Derabanan if you do roiv. Meaning, Avad Min HaTorah roiv's enough. Hence the Kohen Gadol gets away with it. The chiddush of our Mishnah is that there's no psul derabbanan. Okay. Says the Gemara, Hachi Gomer, Yochel Yeh Pasal Miderabbanan, the Salgadei Dechamina Ikap Psul Derabbanan, Lakach Shaninu Revecha Barev B'Shem Behema. Now here's the question though. That's just a side point. The conclusion of this Mishnah and the Mishnah Yuma is that roiv is enough. There's no psul derabbanan, roiv is fine. So let me ask you a question. So why taka is another person cutting the rest? The Kohen Gadol does roiv, and then he's busy, he's on his way. So that should be enough. Why taka do you have someone else finish it? There's no psul, it's kosher. So what's the problem? Says the Gemara, Me'achad afil psul derabbanan leka lamali lameirak. So why does someone finish it? The answer is mitzvah lamarek. There's a mitzvah to finish it in order for have the blood flow. Meaning, it's a kosher shchita lichachila. There's a separate mitzvah to complete the job, and that can be done by someone else in order for the blood to flow out better. But it has nothing to do with the ma'aser shchita. Ma'aser shchita 100% kosher. I don't know. It's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to be done. That mitzvah has to be done by kehanim, pashtus, but it doesn't need to be done by the kohen gadol. Correct, but it's a separate mitzvah. Who says that guy can do that mitzvah? Tzitzis are also mitzvah. Guy can't do that, huh?
Why wouldn't you just say Ma'al V'Kodesh Ve'Morita?
What do you mean Ma'al V'Kodesh? What are you talking about?
Mishnah starts with Chullin and then you go to kosher.
The Gemara looks a little more than that. Ma'al V'Kodesh. Okay, it's a good point. I don't know. Amr Shemilaka Shisham Levi Sava Ein L'Shchita El B'Soif. This is going to take us to the end of the daf, and this is his cryptic machlokes of, is the shchita only considered the shchita at the end, or is the entire process considered a ma'aser shchita? Now, what does that mean? What is the machlokes? Again, I cut 2 pipes. The question is, it took me 10 seconds. Is second 10 when you completed the ma'aser shchita, or were you shechting the whole time? What's the nafkamina? Who cares? There's obviously some nafkamina. Again, you understand the kasha. I'm shechting 2 pipes. It takes me 10 seconds. The question is, when was I oisik in the shechita? At the end, second number 10, or all 10 seconds? What is the practical ramification? Now, we have to figure this out. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava. Rava clarifies. Hakol moedim, hechad d'shachet simen echad oivik echavim, v'semen echad Yisrael, shipsula. I'll give you one nafkamina, maybe. The Gemara rejects it instantly. A guy cuts the first pipe, and I cut the second pipe. If the shechita is only at the end, it was done by a Jew. It was completed by a Jew. But if the shechita is considered the entire thing, a ma'aseh shechita, then part of the shechita was done by a guy. That can't be. Why? Again, we're looking for a nafkamina between this machlekes. That can't be a nafkamina. Why? Because if a guy shechs one pipe, the animal's a treifa. So if the guy made it a treifa, it's avad psul. I don't care what the lumdis is, metchil avad soif, ein elab soif. If a guy shechs one pipe, the animal's a ma'aseh treifa. So the Gemara says, "Shipsula shaynasa b'ma'aseh treifa yadav v'chavim." Ba'oila soif nami hecha demalik simen echel lamata v'simen echel lamayla psula shari osa b'ma'aseh chata soif lamata. Another nafkamina that it cannot be. You're supposed to cut two of the simanim by the malika by a bird. Ba'oila soif. You're supposed to do that on the top of the mizbeach. Let's say I did one at the bottom of the mizbeach and one on top. That's also not an nafkamina. Meaning, don't say if the shechita is at the end, then it's kosher. The answer is because when you cut one pipe, that's a significant act regarding a chatas oif. So you did a full maisa, meaning the same way one pipe causes it to be a treifa, one pipe causes it to be a treifa. So if you do it in the wrong location, for sure that's a problem. The entire oilas oif must be done on the top of the mizbeach. So what is a nafkamina between Rav Yochanan, Rish Lakish, and Rav Yochanan of whether the shechita is metchil avad soif or eina elab soif? So, says the Gemara, here's the case. I take an animal, I shecht one, it's a carbon, I shecht one pipe outside of the Beis HaMikdash, and then I walk it in and I do the second inside the Beis HaMikdash. Is it considered shchutei chutz? Am I going to be punished for bringing a carbon outside of the Beis HaMikdash? If the shechita is only at the end, so then I did it inside. If it's metchil avad, part of the ma'aseh shechita was on the outside. The problem is, says the Gemara, says the Gemara, that cannot be. That's not the way Rav Yosef explained it to me. Why? He says, I don't understand. When you shech, I take a cow, yeah? I shech the first siman when I'm standing outside of the Beis HaMikdash, right? The problem is, I did a ma'aseh treifa outside of the Beis HaMikdash. A ma'aseh treifa means a significant act. So if I basically killed the animal, I did a ma'aseh treifa outside of the Beis HaMikdash, it's avada puzzle. So the point is, because cutting one pipe is considered a ma'aseh treifa, if I shecht one pipe outside of the Beis HaMikdash, of course that's a puzzle carbon. You can't bring that as a carbon. No question. So what is the nafkamina? So the Gemara says, the case is where you cut 33% of one pipe outside of the Beis HaMikdash and then you finish it on the inside. That's the nafkamina. Of course, if you cut one pipe outside of the Beis HaMikdash, that's going to passel the carbon because you made it a treifa outside of the Beis HaMikdash. The case is where you took the first pipe, you cut 33% outside of the Beis HaMikdash, then you went in and did the rest. If the shechita is only at the end, the entire significant part of the animal was shechted inside. It's going to be a kosher carbon. If the shechita is the entire time, then it's considered partially done outside of the Beis HaMikdash. It's going to be puzzle. That is the nafkamina. Now, the Gemara has a few questions. We'll finish up in about 5 minutes. The Gemara says like this. Masiv Rav Zera. Okay, basically, it's like this. This is a Mishnah dealing with the laws of Parah Aduma. There's two things to remember about Parah Aduma that you need to know before we begin, and that is everyone who's oisik in any chelik of a kosher Parah Aduma becomes tameh. Every step, okay? And number two, there's a special Gzeres HaKasa by the Parah Aduma that if you do an act of the Parah Aduma and at the same time do something else, it invalidates the Parah Aduma. So I'll give you an example. I'm shechting the Parah Aduma and I put right next to the neck of the Parah Aduma, I put a carrot. So as I'm shechting it, I'm also cutting a carrot. It passels the Parah Aduma. Whatever the case is, if you're oisik in something else at the same time, it invalidates it. Now that you know that there's an machloikes whether shechita is at the end or metchila sevad soifer, the Gemara has the following question. The Mishnah says like this: Masar Rav Zera, kol asukim bepara, anyone who's oisik in the Parah Aduma, metchila sevad soif, whether the beginning of the avodah, middle or end, metamen begadim becomes tameh. Upois l'noisim locha cheres, and every stage of the Parah Aduma will become invalid if you're oisik in something else. That is the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah clarifies. Let's say while I'm shechting the para aduma, something goes wrong. So you know what the halacha is? And let's say a very simple case. I'm shechting the para aduma, and I don't realize at this point, but I invalidated the para aduma. I made it an avela. Right? But then I finish it. You burn it, you sprinkle, whatever. You know what the halacha is? Is anyone tameh? The halacha is nobody is tameh. Why? Because it's megal l'mafreya. When I shechted, it wasn't a kosher para aduma. So says the Mishnah, if when I shechted it, it was pasul, so it was never a para aduma. So then, bein koidim psula, bein lachar psula, eina metam begadim. No one is tameh begadim because there was no ma'aser shrita. It was never. It was DOA. You may only have found out about that later, but it's DOA. Good. But Bahazaso, let's say, Rabbi, you did a kosher shchita, you shechted the paraduma, everything fine. I messed up in the sprinkling. I invalidated the sprinkling. So then, sprinkling onward, no one is tameh. But before sprinkling, you are tameh. Why? Because what you did was valid at the time. Fair. So far, so good. That is the Mishnah. What does this have to do with our discussion? What did the Mishnah say? If you shech the carbon, this is very simple. Just hear it outside. If you shech the carbon and something goes wrong, the halacha is no one is tameh. Why? Because there's nothing. But wait a minute. If you believe that the entire ma'aser shchita is a ma'aser shchita, then why don't we say this? If I shech the shchita, so if you were oisik, let's say in the first pipe, you cut the first pipe properly, then you're tameh. Meaning, if you believe that it's a shchita from beginning to end, so every aspect of what you did is something, it's part of it. So then, don't just tell me if you mess up by the shchita, there's no tuma. No. Get more detailed. Get a little more detail and say, if the psul happened in the middle of the shchita, then the person who did the first part of the shchita, meaning get into details. Because the Gemara assumes that if you mess up in the shchita, but you believe that the shchita is mitchilas avad sofo, you'll still become tameh. So the Gemara says, and should say, so the Gemara says, well, your presumption is wrong. What's your presumption? That the assumption is that if you passel it during the shchita, but you believe that yeshna shchita mitchilas avad sofo, you'll still become tameh. Because you did something. The Gemara says, Amar Rava, niskalkel shchita kamert. When you mess up during the shchita, shani asam igloi milsam afrei lav shchita yiklal. There's no such thing. When you mess up the shchita, I don't care how you look at shchita, but beginning to end, it's nothing. You want to argue that mitchilas avad sofo or sofo is a separate shaila, but if you mess up the shchita, no one is going to say that you should become tameh for what you did. I cut the first pipe, and then I mess up in the second pipe. I should be tameh because I cut the first pipe. The first pipe is nothing. I thought the shchita is beginning to end. Yeah, when it's a proper shchita. when you, it's not a good shchita. It's nothing.
What about the sprinkling? If you mess up the sprinkling, if you did the shchita,
then the shchita was done. So then you're tameh. So says the Gemara, Amar Rava, ikash li hakash. I have one more question. Again, the question is, why did the Mishnah say the halachas that if you mess up by the shchita, no one is tameh, but by sprinkling, then before the sprinkling, you are tameh after? Why didn't the Mishnah talk more? So it says, here's my kasha. If you believe that the shchita is only at the end, then liflog bechsher de para. Going to shaktua betray gavre, the gavra kama loy metama, the gavra basra metama. The Gemara says, why don't we have the following case? Very simple. Me and you, we're both holding the knife. I do the first part, then you do the second part. By karbonos you can't do this, but the Gemara assumes that by paraduma you can. So I do the first part, you do the second part. Who's tameh? If you believe that the shchita is only at the end, then the only one that's tameh is the one who did the shchita. If you believe that shchita is mitchilas avad sofo, we're both tameh. Why doesn't the Mishnah mention that? Meaning, the Mishnah is mentioning. Now, by the way, I'll tell you the Gemara's conclusion. The Gemara's conclusion is actually, because now you did the flow, the Gemara is going to answer. The reason why I didn't mention that is because the Mishnah is not just mentioning everyone that's tameh. The Mishnah is specifically mentioning where stages of the shchita or the hazah, something went wrong. And basically it's telling you before the psul, you're tameh, after the psul, you're not. Now you're just having a new question, which is, just mention this. I shech the first part, I do the first pipe, you take the second pipe. If you believe that the shechita is at the end, you're tameh because you're the one who finished it. If it's beginning to end, we're both tameh. Good question. So the Gemara says, I thought you're not able to have two people shecht one animal by karbanos. You can't do that, right? Because it says tizbach, tizbachehu, one sheichet, right? And paraduma is a carbon. So says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yosef, Trei Gavri b'chad zivcha kamret. You want two people to shecht one animal by a carbon? Bar minedehi. That doesn't count. Why? The Tanina tizbach shleishnaim shechtim zech v'echad tizbecheyu sheyechad shechet shnei zoachim v'amar Rav Kana tizbecheyu ksiv. We just had this. Two people cannot shecht one carbon. So Gemara says, okay, and we'll end with this. Amar li Abai lav itmar Allah Amar Rabbi Chan Amar Rav Yochanan zudiv Rav Elazar Rav Shimon. Point number one. This concept that you can't have two people shecht one carbon, that we said tiz b'chehu, whatever, that's not universally accepted. That's the shita of Rav Elazar Rav Shimon. Stimsa, aval chachamim oimrin, the chum disagree. They actually say, shnaim sheichtim zevet ahad. Two people can't shecht one carbon. As long as there's no pause in between, I don't know how you do that. Basically, we both hold the knife, and then I do the first pipe, and then I let go, and then you do the second. This concept that you can't have two people doing it, that's Rav Elazar Rav Shimon. The Chum disagree. So back to the original point. If the Rabbanim believe that you could have two people doing it, then mention that's a nafkamina. Me and you shech the carbon paraduma. I do the first part, you do the second part. If the shechita is at the end, you're tameh. If it's chilasav, we're both tameh. And question number two, Rav Elazar Rav Shimon nami lefik. I have another case. You're going to shacha chag aver b'shnei sturim. The sudir kama le matama, the sudir basim matama. Okay, you're shechting, and you're shechting the paraduma, and what's the halach when you shech the paraduma? You become tameh, and your clothing become tameh. Here's the case: you have two hats on. You're wearing two hats, and then as you cut the second pipe, I pull the second half off. So the question is, how many hats are tameh? Both hats, hat A and B were on in the beginning, but hat B was the only one at the end. If you believe the shechita is from beginning to end, they're both tameh. If it's only at the end, only the second hat is tameh. Why not mention that? See, another Gemara says these are great points. But you know what the answer is? That's not what the Mishnah is Isaac in. The Mishnah is not Isaac in just listing cases of Tumah. The Mishnah is specifically talking about a situation where something went wrong. A psul happened by the shechita, a psul happened by the hazah, whatever, by the sreifa, and then it's telling you the halacha, before psul, tameh, post psul, not tameh. You're just having good questions, which is mention this, and you're trying to bring a raya, yesh l'tchim etchilat soif, ein ala b'soif. That's not what the Mishnah is doing. We'll end with this. The Gemara says, Ella b'psul de para kamari bechsher lekamari. We're not talking about a case where everything was done properly and you're having interesting nafkaminas. We're talking about where something went wrong. So that's not what the Mishnah's Isaac went b'chalal. So it's not a raya either way. To yeshin b'chilavad saif ein ela b'saif. I'll stop here.